Title: The Disturbing Shadows. Main story: Lukas Lang was always known for his unusual and disturbing artwork. His paintings were never easy to look at, but people couldn't seem to look away. Despite the unease his paintings caused, they always managed to captivate and draw people in. Lukas was a rising star in the art world, but little did he know that his work would soon take on a life of its own. It all started one day when Lukas was working on a new painting. He had been feeling particularly inspired that day, and the canvas in front of him was already starting to take shape. The scene depicted a dark, foreboding forest, with twisted trees and a thick fog that obscured everything beyond the first few feet. In the distance, Lukas had added a small, run-down cabin that looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was an eerie scene, to be sure, but Lukas was pleased with how it was turning out. As he worked, Lukas noticed that the painting seemed to be changing. The fog in the background began to swirl and move, almost as if it were alive. The trees seemed to shift and bend in the wind, even though there was no breeze in the room. And then, the cabin in the distance began to glow with an eerie light that seemed to come from within. Lukas was transfixed, unable to move or speak as he watched his painting come to life before his eyes. Suddenly, he was jolted back to reality by a loud banging on his door. It was his friend, Amy Morris. "Are you okay?" she asked, concerned. "I heard some strange noises coming from your studio." Lukas tried to explain what had happened, but he struggled to find the words. Amy was skeptical at first, but when Lukas showed her the painting, she could see that something was definitely not right. The two of them spent the next few hours trying to figure out what was happening, but they couldn't make sense of it. That's when they began to notice that Lukas' other paintings were also starting to change. The eyes of the figures in his portraits seemed to follow them around the room, and the animals in his landscapes began to move and make noise. It was as if Lukas' paintings were coming to life, and they weren't friendly. As the days went on, the situation only grew more dire. Lukas' paintings were appearing in galleries all over the world, and each one seemed to be causing more chaos than the last. The people who viewed them were becoming increasingly agitated and violent, and it wasn't long before the authorities got involved. Lukas and Amy knew that they had to put a stop to this, but they didn't know how. They tried burning the paintings, but that only seemed to make things worse. They tried locking them away, but the paintings always found a way to escape. It was as if Lukas' work had taken on a life of its own, and there was no stopping it. In the end, Lukas and Amy decided that they had to confront the source of the problem head-on. They returned to Lukas' studio and stood in front of the painting that had started it all. It was even more disturbing now, with the cabin in the background engulfed in flames and strange, shadowy figures moving in the foreground. Lukas and Amy stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the painting and waiting for something to happen. And then, suddenly, the figures in the painting began to move. They stepped out of the canvas and into the real world, each one more terrifying than the last. Lukas and Amy were trapped, with no way out. The figures from Lukas' paintings surrounded them, closing in on them with each passing second. Lukas and Amy were frozen in fear, unable to move or fight back. It seemed like the end was near. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the shadowy figures stepped forward and spoke. Its voice was deep and raspy, and it seemed to come from all around them. "I am the embodiment of your art," it said. "I am the darkness that lurks within your mind, brought to life by your brushstrokes. But I am not here to harm you. I am here to make you see." The figure reached out and touched Lukas on the forehead. Suddenly, Lukas was flooded with images of all the things he had ever painted. He saw the darkness, the despair, and the terror that he had been trying to capture all along. And he saw how it affected the people who looked at his work. Tears streamed down Lukas' face as he realized the harm that his art had caused. He had never intended to hurt anyone, but he had been so caught up in his own vision that he hadn't considered the impact it would have on others. The figure from the painting disappeared back into the canvas, and Lukas and Amy were left alone in the studio. But things were different now. Lukas had a new perspective on his work, and he knew that he needed to change his ways. He began to paint again, but this time his work was different. It was still dark and unsettling, but there was also a glimmer of hope in each piece. And people responded to it in a different way. They were still captivated, but they were also moved. Years later, Lukas became known as one of the greatest painters of his time. His work was celebrated around the world, and he was hailed as a visionary. But he never forgot the lessons he had learned in that dark studio, and he always approached his work with a sense of responsibility and empathy. The paintings that had once haunted him were now a reminder of where he had been, and how far he had come. And though he would never forget the darkness that had lurked within him, Lukas knew that he had found a way to channel it into something beautiful. As Lukas continued to paint, he discovered that he had a new ability. He could now control the entities that he brought to life through his art. He used this power to create pieces that were both terrifying and beautiful, and his fame grew even more. But with this newfound power came a new danger. There were those who were envious of Lukas' success, and they would stop at nothing to steal his secrets. One night, Lukas was working in his studio when he heard a noise. He turned around to see a group of people, their faces obscured by shadows, approaching him. Lukas recognized them as his former classmates from the School of Arts. They had always been jealous of his talent, and now they wanted to steal his power for themselves. Lukas knew that he couldn't let them take his gift away, so he stood his ground. A fierce battle ensued, with Lukas using his control over his paintings to fight back against his attackers. His studio was destroyed in the process, but he emerged victorious. The attackers fled, defeated, and Lukas was left standing amidst the ruins of his life's work. But Lukas was not discouraged. He knew that he could rebuild, and that his art was worth fighting for. And so he began again, creating new pieces that were even more powerful than before. His reputation continued to grow, and he was hailed as a genius. But despite all of his success, Lukas never forgot the lessons he had learned. He knew that art was a powerful tool, and that it could be both a source of beauty and a source of terror. And so he continued to paint, always striving to strike a balance between the light and the dark. Years passed, and Lukas' fame only continued to grow. His paintings were now revered as masterpieces, and he was considered one of the greatest artists of his time. But Lukas knew that his power came at a price, and he had become increasingly isolated as a result. He had no friends or family left, as his obsession with his art had consumed him entirely. The only person he ever spoke to was Amy, his old friend from the School of Arts. She had stood by him through thick and thin, and Lukas valued her friendship more than anything in the world. One day, as Lukas was working in his studio, he received a visit from a wealthy collector. The man had heard of Lukas' incredible talent and wanted to purchase one of his paintings for his private collection. Lukas was hesitant at first, but the man was insistent. He offered Lukas a sum of money that was too tempting to refuse, and Lukas finally agreed to sell him one of his paintings. But as soon as the collector left, Lukas began to feel uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a terrible mistake. And then, he realized what was wrong. He had sold the wrong painting. The painting he had sold was one of his earlier pieces, a portrait of a dark figure that he had brought to life through his art. Lukas knew that he needed to get it back before it was too late. But it was already too late. The figure from the painting had come to life once again, and it was wreaking havoc on the world. People were disappearing without a trace, and there were rumors of a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness. Lukas knew that he had to act fast. He contacted Amy, and together, they set out to track down the collector who had bought the painting. They followed a trail of destruction, with each step bringing them closer to their goal. Finally, they found the collector's mansion. It was a sprawling, Gothic building that seemed to emanate an aura of darkness. They entered cautiously, and were immediately met with a sight that chilled them to the bone. The figure from the painting was there, looming over the collector with an expression of malice. It turned to face Lukas and Amy, its eyes glowing with a sinister light. "You should not have sold me," it said. "Now, you will pay the price." Lukas and Amy knew that they were outmatched, but they refused to back down. They stood their ground, ready to fight to the death if necessary. And then, something miraculous happened. The figure from the painting suddenly disappeared, sucked back into the canvas from which it had emerged. Lukas realized that he had the power to control his creations once again, and he used it to defeat the creature that had threatened him and Amy. As they left the mansion, Lukas and Amy knew that they had been lucky to escape with their lives. But Lukas also knew that he had learned a valuable lesson. He had been so caught up in his own obsession that he had lost sight of what was truly important in life. So, he returned to his old studio, the place where everything had started. As he walked through the empty room, memories flooded back to him, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. He approached his old easel, where he had painted so many dark and twisted scenes. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up a brush and began to paint. At first, he painted simple landscapes, trying to regain his confidence. But then, he felt a strange pull, and he found himself painting a scene of a dark forest, with gnarled trees and twisted roots. As he painted, he felt a surge of energy flow through him, and he knew that he had tapped into something powerful. He kept painting, letting the scene unfold in front of him. Suddenly, the air around him began to crackle with electricity. The room filled with a blinding light, and Lukas felt himself being lifted off the ground. He closed his eyes, feeling the power surge through him. When he opened them again, he saw that the forest he had painted was no longer on his canvas. It was real, and he was standing right in the middle of it. He looked around, seeing the twisted trees and dark shadows looming all around him. He knew that he had to get out, but he didn't know how. Suddenly, he heard a voice behind him. "Lukas," it whispered, "you have to destroy the painting. It's the only way to get back." He turned around and saw a figure standing in the shadows. It was Amy, his old friend from art school. "How did you get here?" he asked, astonished. "I followed you," she said. "I knew that you needed help." Together, they began to search for the painting. They knew that it was the key to getting back to the real world. After what felt like hours of searching, they finally found it, tucked away in a dark corner of the forest. Lukas took a deep breath and raised his brush. He painted a single stroke, and the canvas erupted in flames. The fire quickly spread, consuming everything in its path. As the flames died down, Lukas and Amy found themselves back in the studio. They were panting, covered in sweat and ash. Lukas knew that he had finally defeated the demons that had haunted him for so long. He had faced his fears and emerged victorious. He turned to Amy and smiled. "Thank you," he said. "I couldn't have done it without you." Amy smiled back. "That's what friends are for," she said. And with that, Lukas knew that he had found true friendship and a new sense of purpose. He would use his art to create beauty and hope, and he would never forget the lessons he had learned in the dark forest. The end.